you for joining the Seraph January 2025 Automotive Industry Webinar. I'm joined today by Jay Butler, Justin Fortier, and Harrison Catlin. We're going to be spending some time today talking about the automotive industry and how global geopolitical events are shaping it. Specifically, we're going to take a look at tariffs and how deglobalization is impacting the industry. We'll look at talent. What's going on with talent? Talent has been a major issue over the years. We think it will continue to be an issue in 2025. And finally, technology. We've all been plagued and challenged by the EV transition, the shift back to ICE engines, and the consumer demand for hybrids. Lots of opportunities exist here. Before we get started, I want to thank each and every one of you who took the time to complete the survey that we have. That survey feeds this report. That, with other industry data that's publicly available, gives us the ability to develop this report and share our insights with you. Without your input, this would be a much less valuable exercise. I also want to express my thanks to each and every one of you that's joining this webinar, that's putting your valuable time to listen and learn from and with us. I look forward to questions. You have the ability to submit questions throughout the webinar. At the end of the webinar, we will come back and we will answer your questions. On that note, I'd like to kick things off. So let's jump into the webinar now. Thanks very much. So let's jump right into the survey highlights here, because the survey is really a critical part to everything that we're trying to do here with this automotive webinar at Seraph. So looking back at 2024's biggest challenges, there was a lot going on. Key for me, though, are a couple of things. Volumes challenged all of us in the industry. Volumes were low, volumes were inconsistent, and volumes, according to technology, were the bane of a lot of our existence. We saw a lot of challenges in terms of financial stability, and Europe was a particular standout there. Volkswagen, Michelin, others have gotten themselves into very challenging financial positions that we did not expect we'd ever see. They've had to work very hard to start to overcome them, and there's a big challenge ahead. We've had to manage our expectations around technology in terms of EVs, hybrids, and ICE. We saw a big shift away from the pure, we're going to do EVs, government support, and drive for it. Subsidies have disappeared, and now we're entering 2025 in a realm where EVs have to stand on their own. Looking ahead, geopolitics and the new US administration are absolutely key, and we have to stay on top of what is going to change. Trump is nothing if not an opinionated person, and his opinions come out very clearly and quickly and often become policy. Volumes and financial pressures are top of mind for both OEMs and suppliers. From an OEM position, we've got a few things that are really driving problems. Geopolitics and the new US administration are top of mind, and those are the things that everyone is focused on. No one knows what's going to happen with tariffs. Volumes are a challenge. What technology do they need to build? The incentives that were there for EVs have disappeared. We believe tariffs are coming into place. Things are going to look different, and supply chains need to be realigned in order to accommodate this changing market dynamic. From a supplier perspective, financial performance has been awful. Corporate coffers haven't refilled since the pandemic. OEMs aren't in a position to bail out suppliers as they once were. Suppliers have to stand on their own, and those that invested heavily and made bets for EV technology are in a very challenged position. Couple that with tariffs that we're going to start seeing, and we're going to see a lot more stress and pressure come on the supply base. Let's talk a little bit about volumes and financials. Consumers continue to avoid high prices. With inflation, they just can't afford the vehicles that the OEMs want to sell. High margin, ultra luxury premium vehicles, consumers stretch to buy them because they had no choice. Choice is back, so we have to rationalize.
And I think it's important to note that the subsidies that were once present at the start of COVID that were providing consumers extra comfort are now mostly spent through. And so let's get into it.
Good point, Justin. So for the first time in 4 years, publicly traded suppliers are doing better margin-wise than OEMs. But this is the public suppliers. This isn't everyone. So if we take a look at that, we're seeing things start to improve. So the large suppliers, those that have the most leverage, those that can negotiate with the OEMs, those that can make claims and enforce claims, are seeing success. The smallest and weakest 20% of suppliers are in exactly the opposite position. Those are privately held companies that aren't publicly reported. But when you look at debt and you look at other measures, they are in real trouble. That data is harder to get and show, but it's very clear. And OEMs are tracking it very, very closely. The net balance of power is starting to shift back to suppliers. The OEMs need to be very aware and manage the weakest suppliers of the bunch. The main concern throughout the industry really has, throughout 2024, been volumes. It was a dramatic shift from when it was about labor and talent. That labor and talent thread still is going through there, but because people don't have demand, because they're not being forced to run at volume, it's much harder to feel a need to hire people. When you're looking at cutting, labor and talent aren't the main focus, but they will be again very soon.
In my discussions, both also at the supplier and with some OEMs, a lot of that market demand concern and volume is particularly focused on the EV transition. I think everybody had their fingers crossed and were betting and investing that we'd be a lot further along in the US in terms of EV adoption, but it's just not played out. And so that's put a lot of pressure not only on OEMs, but also that number two topic, there's supply chain instability. You've got a lot of suppliers that geared up to be EV only, and those volumes are so low. It's putting unbelievable pressure on the supply base, especially in those cases where they were betting on EV.
Supply chain instability was another challenge. But supply chain instability can be linked in many, many ways to volumes. The financial distress that we're seeing, underperformance from supplier, comes from releases that are changing, things that aren't getting updated, payment issues, not being able to communicate to tier end suppliers and make sure that they have a clear plan to run. Supply chains are very difficult to slow and control. It's much easier when you're steady state or growing in a controlled way. Ramping down is not something that we're designed to do. And 2024 ended up being a year where we needed to control and ramp down. Operational challenges also played a big impact here. And the operational challenges, I will argue, had a lot to do with cost pressures and inflation impact. Because of the cost pressures, because of the inflation impact, people were making tactical short term decisions to cut things, to run leaner, to try to do what they could to improve the bottom line.
And one call out that I'd want to have is because if you look at when we talk about volumes, some people might look and say EV growth did occur in the US, but it's as probably everybody on this call can appreciate, it didn't feel like that. And one of the reasons was because expectations were set much higher. And in automotive, expectations led to lots of investment and setting up totally new factories or new production lines and training a bunch of people. So you may look and see the growth, but the growth was not anywhere near what the plans were from different OEMs, especially in Europe and the US.
It didn't meet the generational investment that was made to transform the industry. There was the true generational investment to make EVs the new platform moving forward, where people were saying, we're going to discontinue our ICE engines. We're not going to build another. We're not going to design another. That's almost completely reversed. And we expect to see a big change in 2025. We expect the volume issue in Europe to continue to deteriorate. China competition is going to continue to be a real challenge. In the US, we're seeing light vehicle sales down slightly, but the US put tariffs in place of 100% on Chinese vehicles, which could increase. The Chinese are effectively blocked from coming into the US market. There are backdoors that may be being tried. There are plants that are being looked at in Mexico. We don't know what's going to happen. Maybe the new administration will offer the Chinese OEMs the opportunity to partner with US OEMs and build plants here so that we can do technology transfer, much like China did. We'll have to wait and see. In Europe, it's a very different story. Chinese are already coming in, tariffs are much lower, and they're to the point where they're not bridging the gap between what it costs to build a vehicle with quality European components and European labor that's paid a fair wage, and the Works Council is supporting all of that, versus what happens in China, where things are done at a state subsidized rate with less capital invested by the company and more technology leveraging from the outside. Europe also is experiencing a challenge, and I'm going to include the UK in Europe here for a moment. The UK has been in a recession. The pound is weak. People don't feel like they have money. In Germany, we're in a recession. Energy prices are high. So vehicle registrations are down. And as they stay down through 2025, which is what we're predicting, we're going to see more people looking at lower priced, high value vehicles. I would love to say that the Chinese vehicles that I've seen were cheap or were not of quality, but both at IAA and at CES recently, the vehicles that I was able to sit in were amazing. They were high quality, they were well built, they were very nice vehicles, which were extremely competitive at the Chinese price point. And even if you add a 30% tariff to most of these vehicles, they are extremely competitive in the European market. In the United States, total vehicle inventories have mostly stabilized. And this really is a US topic because in Europe, vehicles are generally built to order. So we don't see inventories of vehicles. We'll see the Chinese starting to ship and hold inventories as other foreign OEMs do. But in the US, we build to inventory, not to order.
You go back to COVID when COVID hit and inventories dropped, the plants were shut down and the inventories got real low, but inventories have exploded. And I know here in outside of Birmingham, Alabama, where I'm from, the vehicle lots, especially for, we'll say the Detroit Three, so GM products, Stellantis, and Ford products, those lots are full again. And in some cases, they are got vehicles everywhere, and it seems that they're just not moving. And I think if you watch TV now, you're starting to see big rebates, three, four, five, $6,000 rebates. Some of the car companies financing now, their zero interest is coming back up again. So those inventories are extremely high, and I know in some cases days on hand for some automakers is over 120 days of inventory sitting on dealer lots.
And to get granular, we're up from just over 1 million in new vehicle inventory in 2022. And in December 24, we're at 3.15 million, which translates to about 85 days of supply on dealer lots, according to Cox. And some of the higher brands, including most of the Stellantis lineup, Ram is at 128, Jeep is at 129 days, Ford is 125, and Lincoln is even north of that. And to just add in a comparison with a global data point, China currently has about the same level of inventory with 3.2 million vehicles there. And that equates, because they're selling many more vehicles, to only about 50 days on hand of inventory there in November. And now let's talk a bit more about affordability.
We're seeing new vehicle transaction price also stabilizing. It has increased significantly from 2019. But from the start of the year to now, it's relatively flat. And a big part of that is consumers just can't afford the prices that we're at right now. So list prices of vehicles remained stable through the course of 2024, but interest rates rose. Household incomes also rose a bit because of inflation. And we're seeing a bit more affordability because the OEMs need to drive incentives. 0% APR, rebates, and other incentives are making vehicles more affordable right now. The prices are staying the same. Affordability is improving simply because people are getting raises, and rather than having to use an unsubsidized interest rate to buy the vehicle, OEMs are more likely now to provide subsidies through financing or rebates, which lower the payment.
And those incentives are coming because of the inventory picture we were just looking at previously, which leads into capacity.
So we've got a real challenge here when we look globally in terms of capacity. I remember a lot of talk in the early 2000s and in the 2010s about how we were overcapacitized in the US and in Europe. We saw some plant closures, we saw different things happen to take capacity out at an OEM level.
Overall, my takeaway from this info from global data is that there's lots of extra global capacity. And with volumes being one of the main challenges we saw in our survey, that suggests to me that there's opportunity for consolidation.
The other thing I think is interesting also in this chart, just to highlight this one, is that China has a lot of capacity to build vehicles. So 60%, and we talk about this onslaught coming from China, and they have a lot of room to run.
On that China note, digging into the data a little bit, you can't see it on here, but the utilization of EV production plants is much higher than the average in China. So China has a lot of ICE plants that are seeing below this utilization. So those may end up in different global markets like South America and different regions. One other thing to consider in North America, and you might see a little bit of this forecasted out in the future here, is that there's been a few factory projects that have been started and paused or slowed down. And so there is some significant, especially EV related investment in North America that we're waiting to see how it materializes.
Factory utilization is not great. 76% of respondents say that their factories are performing at lower capacity than usual. Now, if we break this down and we really look in detail, the key driver here, as I talked about volume, it's lower demand. Because as Justin talked about earlier, we have high inventory levels for most, if not all brands, and that is driving volume down lower. So there's a lot of talk around what's going to happen in different regions around the world, and tariffs here are going to play another part. We conducted this survey in early December, and in early December, Trump had just announced that he was going to be putting tariffs in place on Mexico. The survey went out about a week after that statement was made. I'm going to say that very few people believed that that was even possible. I had questions, is that legal? Can that happen? Unfortunately, the answer is because he's pushing it as a national security measure, yes, it can happen. But what we're seeing here is Mexico has a high level of confidence. We're seeing the investment that's been made, that's been committed. Foreign direct investment is increasing. We're still seeing challenges with labor. We're seeing challenges with power. There's a concern about crime. But everybody understands that Mexico is a place where you can manufacture. And because of USMCA, companies that need to ship things into America are focusing on Mexico. In the US, people are less positive. About 49% of our survey respondents saw things shrinking. They were less optimistic than they were before. Operational footprints are being looked at very actively, and we all want to and continue to do that. And then in Western Europe, people are pessimistic. Conversations that I had in December really highlighted the fact that volumes are going down. OEMs are planning for significant volume decreases even in through 2025. As we see that continue, as we see more pressure from the Chinese, we're going to see different things happen. So what does it really mean? When we look at the underutilization of factories, we're really going to be able to see consolidation that can happen. When we look at doing footprint decisions, when we look at modeling things out, we do something called strategic alignment, and we put together a management plan. In the strategic alignment phase, we look to understand what are all the financial levers that could impact the establishment of a factory in a specific location. Trade barriers and taxes, for that matter, all need to be modeled and have sensitivities associated with them. And if you're not doing that, if you're not looking at your footprint, your manufacturing network in a way where you can model taxes and trade barriers, you're doing something that's a disservice to your organization.
So another thing we asked our clients and the folks that responded to the survey was, given the fact that they can't directly impact these volumes, what are you focusing on to drive profitability in your organization. And we talked about when you're running like crazy and your volumes are through the roof, you can sometimes be a little sloppy. When those volumes get low and you're running super lean, you've got to start looking other places. And so we're seeing, which is an area that we always think companies should focus on, is reducing scrap and cost of quality, reducing downtime. It's You want to be able to fill your plant up and run 5.5 days a week. It's not good to run 7 days a week. We often see that in our practice where companies get into that vicious cycle and that hurts them in so many other ways. But you need a full paycheck, so you need a 40-hour week. And right now, with some of these volumes, plants aren't even full to a 40-hour week, right? It's you got 3-4 days. You've done your volume for the week. So companies are starting to look other places to really trim the fat out of their operation, whether it's quality costs, it's scrap, it's reducing downtime so they maximize when they're paying those operators, those machines are running. Those machines are producing good parts that they can ship on to their customer. Logistics costs is another area that we're seeing more and more emphasis on. We're trying to free up cash when we got such low volumes.
So commercially, automotive leaders are looking at bigger things. What can we do systemically? And when you think about that, plant consolidations and restructuring is going to be a key theme for this year, for 2025. I've done a lot of plant consolidations, I've done a lot of relocations, and I've done a lot of restructuring work. What we need to think about here is we need to figure out what is our real goal from a manufacturing network, manufacturing footprint consolidation project. We're trying to take out SG&A expense. We're trying to take out that building, all the management that's there. Our direct labor is going to cost us the same no matter where we are. Ideally, we have logistics savings opportunities. So if we move two plants together, we've got three different plants, all of whom have excess capacity. If we can consolidate everything into one of the plants, we only have one set of overhead. We've got one plant manager, we've got one quality manager, et cetera. We free up some capital in terms of the buildings that we had. We can consolidate things together. We have less overhead that we have to deal with, and we can operate much more efficiently. But when you go through that exercise, we need to make sure that we're modeling it effectively. We need to understand what's the tribal knowledge that exists. Is the product ready to transfer? Can we actually make this happen? And you need to resist the temptation to change everything as you try to move it. We want to minimize the variables that we have, and we want to move in a very systemic, focused way where we can control for all the radical changes that we expect to see as the operation moves. Finally, we want to make sure that we're looking very aggressively at not taking too much capacity out. While we want to cut, we don't want to cut to the bone. If we cut to the bone, if we have no extra space, we're not going to be able to recover from challenges that we have. So let's think about this holistically. And I'm happy to discuss this as something I'm passionate about with anybody who's looking at doing this at this point in time. Please reach out after. Tariffs. Trump's team is preparing to implement tariffs. The team in Mar-a-Lago right now is writing executive orders, and there are multiple versions of executive orders getting written. We're hearing we're going to implement quickly, we're going to implement slowly, but we're going to implement. I'm betting that fast implementation is more likely than slow implementation. But there is a group that's advocating for 5% a month increasing tariffs coming in play. That's one approach. The other approach is the big bang. Let's get tariffs in here quickly. Let's shock the system and let's move forward. So as the trade war is intensifying, that's the big concern. That's what everyone is talking about. Or maybe that's what they're talking about with me because I like to talk about tariffs. So Trump 2.0 is going to be very different than the first administration. We're seeing people being nominated. We're already seeing him putting people up to get approved. There is a focus right now on having a solid administration that's fully staffed from very early on so that they can achieve things. This is not going to be try to figure out what the agenda is. There's a defined agenda. Part of that is strengthening American manufacturing and preparing America for potential global conflicts. What does that mean, and why do we care about it in an automotive webinar? So taxes are a key thing that I'm going to talk about before I even go into tariffs, because Prior to World War II, the United States economy was almost completely funded by tariffs. Taxes are a new thing, but we all know them very well. It's the only way we've ever seen the US government funded. Trump has promised cuts in tax rates for US corporations. So the statement that he has made, if you manufacture your products in the US, he wants to give you a 15% corporate tax rate. That's low. That aligns to Ireland, and really all the pharma companies that have moved to places like Ireland may look at reshoring what they can, because a 15% tax rate here in the US is very positive for them. A 20% tax rate has been proposed for all domestic companies. It's a little bit lower. Again, it's focused on getting companies to come back to the United States. Now, there's a carrot and stick model here. The stick is tariffs on products coming into the US. So Trump has recently come out and through his economic advisory team said they're looking at a 20% tariff on our allies. So 20% on allies. We need to make our allies pay for the services that we're providing for defense, for other things. So a 20% tariff there. If we're charging our friends 20%, that's an eye-opening number and an eye-opening approach. There has been very clear statements on Mexico and Canada. A 25% tariff being imposed on Mexico and Canada if border and drug issues aren't fixed. So we don't see an immediate fix for that, but a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada would not have been possible if Trump hadn't cited national security concerns. National security concerns enable him to override USMCA. The bigger tariffs here really, though, link to China. Chinese vehicles, we expect to see a 100+% tariff for the duration of the Trump administration. Chinese imports in general, we will see it 60% or more. Now, the real threat here is if we don't see movement from China, things have been talked about, including a 100+% tariff on anything containing a Chinese component. So that's the extreme that we're looking at here. And if we take that out to its conclusion, 100+% tariff on anything containing a Chinese component would almost mean any electronic good imported into the United States would have a 100% tariff. That makes it really difficult for the US consumer. So automakers have various levels of exposure to tariffs and components versus vehicle assembly. If we look at the top for both assembly and components, Tesla's really doing well. It has the ability to 100% manufacture cars sold in the US. They are the most American assembled vehicle brand. And if we look at where their supply chain is very North American centric.
And we sourced this data from a few different places. One, there were some disclosure requirements. There was an analysis of where vehicles are assembled. And then for the content, that's a mix of what is disclosed and then analysis done by American University to generate a number they call total domestic content, which refers to where are different components sourced with different weightings, but they also include some credit for R&D. So I just wanted to provide full disclosure. Over the next couple of months, we're going to be doing our own independent analysis of this to really understand where all these supply chains play out. Now, we also took that same information, the 2023 data from the previous slide, and plotted it out. So if you look at the y-axis, that's where the vehicles are assembled. So the percentage in the US. And then if you look at the x-axis, that is the total domestic content score. And the goal of this exercise was really just to crystallize the exposure to some of the tariffs that the incoming president has talked about applying to anyone and everyone, as Ambrose has already discussed.
In the long run, the Trump administration is going to be negotiating and putting in different trade terms with all the major global partners. We're going to be following this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here in this report talking about it, but we'll have a separate discussion outside of this, probably right after Trump comes into office. This is something we're going to be talking about a lot this year, and I think you're all going to be wanting to follow it. Please reach out if you want to know more, and follow Seraph so that you're alerted as we do trade and tariff webinars in the future.
One last case study we wanted to include, because we didn't talk a lot about Europe, because we're mostly talking about the projected plans that Trump has talked about in terms of tariffs in the US. But if we look at Southeast Asia, we can see what the power of the Chinese automotive engine is able to do in taking market share. If you look within China, I think everybody's been following this story of China taking significant share, and players like Japan, USA, and Germany all losing share, as well as Korea and others. But you can see similar things are playing out in Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand. And so this is what Europe may look like, and some other regions where automakers have had success in selling outside of their home market. That is directly in the sights of some of these strong new Chinese players and exporters. We've seen pretty good performance from the MG brand in the UK, and we're starting to see Mexico reported that 20% of their sales are from Chinese imports. So they're still early on collecting that data, so they don't have high quality data sets because a lot of the Chinese brands are not part of their dealer network. But those are some official numbers where they're able to take significant share outside of the US.
And Justin, I'm just going to use this to make a comment that I've shared with many of the OEM executives that I've talked to. Now is not the time to be doubling down on China. The Chinese value proposition is over. I think we've seen the fall off here. Chinese domestic brands are going to be the focus for the Chinese consumer. The Chinese government is incentivizing it. They're driving that. The luxury level brands will still see some sales in China, but even those are going to have to compete with the Chinese luxury brand. As the US goes buy more USA, made in the USA again, Europe may come up with some sort of a made in Germany or made in Europe focus, but it's less likely. China will absolutely continue to push made in China. We've seen that. We can see that here, and we can see that by the fall off in brands. The Japanese have lost the most. The Germans have lost the second most, and the US is very quickly losing. We don't expect non Chinese brands to return to volumes there.
Tesla had a pretty strong year, and so they actually did take share in China this year, but the losses from other brands, if you see here, the net result is a loss. So really outside of Tesla, there's been no gains in China by US brands.
I think that's a good point, Justin. So Tesla actually reduces the fall off of US automakers. The traditional US OEMs are faring much worse than this chart would indicate. Thanks for pointing that out. So talent. I know we're pushing time here, but talent is a key thing that I want to talk about. We're going to see a shift back to focusing on talent. Much like in the 1930s and 1940s when the US re-geared the economy, we're going to see nearshoring and the development of US industry put a strain on labor markets within the US. And we're going to see shifting labor needs in Europe make talent retention a challenge, unlike it's been in a long time. So as companies consider relocation and consolidation, labor is a major concern, and it's both white collar and blue collar. It's both your direct and indirect labor. So employee retention and changes at closing plants, that's a really hard thing to manage. And every time I get involved in plant consolidation, plant closure strategy work, manufacturing network, or supply chain network rationalizations, we look at this. There's a lot that can be done to make the team at the closing plant understand that they're leaving a legacy and move them to a point where you can keep them. There are financial packages you can put in place. There are other things you can do. Getting experts involved early on so that you don't misstep here is absolutely critical. If you lose tribal knowledge, if you lose key employees before you're ready to make the move and transition, things get very, very challenging. And a move that's designed to save you money could end up costing you multiples. Understanding hiring difficulties as you move and what is available in the market, it may make more sense to relocate people. And you need to get your HR teams to stop thinking about cost control and risk management. We need to be thinking about human capital development. It may not feel like it today, But both in the US and Europe, we need to be developing the next generation. We need to be investing into apprenticeship programs. We need to be bringing up management trainees. We need to be making sure that we have the right maintenance people and skilled people. Skilled labor is going to be the hardest thing to replace. And if we're not developing those people now, we're going to have a real problem. The final piece that I'm going to touch on here for this particular slide is project management in terms of executing moves. Very few companies keep that skill set in-house. And if you don't have that in-house, you're very likely to disrupt customers. You're going to underestimate your costs. You're going to overestimate your capacity. You're going to have other challenges that you just can't recover from. If you've kept that skill set in-house, good for you. But if you don't have someone that's done 4 or 5, 10 moves, look outside, get the right help. Having done hundreds of moves, having looked at this, having really supervised and dug deeply early in my career, I understand how hard it is to move lines and move factories. And if you don't have that expertise and if you don't have a good playbook to move forward with, you're very likely going to get into trouble. So talent is one of the things that we talked about. And among the surveyed leaders, labor is one of the leading considerations when they're looking at where to put new plants. Skilled labor in particular is very, very hard to find. People take into account labor costs. They take into account trade restrictions and incentives. There are all these different factors that you want to build in as you're making your case for the move and as you're doing location selection. But you don't want to just do things based on where can you get the lowest cost? What is the tax rate? What are the incentives you're going to get? Don't move based on incentives. Make sure you have a skilled labor force that's going to be able to support you where you are. Make sure you have the right infrastructure and make sure it makes sense from a customer and long-term manufacturing perspective. Don't just move to move. Have the labor there and make sure that it's the right location. There's always a lot of noise. There are always a lot of places that are willing to pay you to come. But even if you're paid to come, if you don't have the right skilled labor, you're going to pay a price in the future. I've been asked a lot, what do we do? Where do we move? How do we maintain a low-cost country strategy? We need it in order to serve the OEMs. They're demanding it. So close proximity, low-cost regions are in favor as people are looking at what they can do. India and Vietnam are seen as growing alternatives to China. But outside of Asia, Mexico continues to be a key, highly attractive place to go. Even with the tariffs, people are still actively looking at Mexico. Although, based on the timing of this survey, I think that Mexico is becoming less attractive. Although the real question is, where do you go? Because we are seeing labor and talent shortages within the US. So it's not easy to reshore everything. And with the capital that's been invested in other places, there's not budget to do it. Eastern Europe continues to be an attractive place to go for Western European countries. We're seeing people move further and further east. The conflict in Ukraine gave people pause, and we're seeing more nervousness than we've seen in a bit. But as we expect the conflict in Ukraine to be resolved by the summer, we should see more focus being on Eastern Europe again. People are again looking at the USA, and that's going to continue to grow. The tariffs that we're talking about, the tax rates that we're seeing being proposed, while not long term, will drive more focus for US based companies to serve the US market out of the US. Technology is a huge challenge. We have made a generational investment in EV infrastructure, and it's still a bottleneck. Subsidies are disappearing, and OEMs are needing to figure out ways to make their products attractive on their own and affordable to the average consumer. Public fast chargers that we've talked about before are still woefully inadequate in the United States. They're a little bit better in Europe, but I can't tell you how many times I've pulled up to a charger and had it not be available. The Tesla supercharging network is their killer app. If you're in a Tesla or can use the Tesla supercharging network, you know that when you pull up, most of the chargers will work. They'll work well. They'll deliver charge at the rate that you expect. If you're going to EVgo, if you're going to ChargePoint, if you're going to others, you may find the cables missing, and the cables have been missing for a week or more. You may find things that are just broken and not working, technical faults, other errors. It takes a while for these to get fixed, and that makes it very, very hard. Right now, the US is not leading in this game. China is the winner in fast charging. And if we look at what they're doing, it's absolutely incredible. They have mapped out and built a fast charging network that supports the infrastructure that they have. Here in the US, if you're in California, you're okay. If you're on the coasts, you can do a little bit better. Tesla moved to Texas, so we're seeing a surge in chargers in Texas. New York makes sense that we're seeing things. But if we look nationwide, we're going to see it. It's very interesting, the groupings of chargers and where you actually have charging infrastructure.
I wanted to share an interesting insight I got reading a report from the China Passenger Car Association. They're targeting a 1-to-1 ratio of new EVs to chargers. And the way they do that is they calculate one public charging pile as the equivalent of 3 private ones. And so they're looking at both public and private EV charging, and they're closely monitoring them to make sure that they can support the OEM growth plans. In comparison, the US and Europe are both much further behind this level of effective investment.
The governments in the West promised a massive investment in EV infrastructures. The automotive OEM made huge bets. The automotive industry in general made massive bets on achieving it. China is the only country that actually followed through and built that infrastructure, Justin, as you were saying. What we're seeing here is we're seeing the gap and the lack of charging infrastructure. If you're in a golden area or a dark gold or a light gold area, then you're okay. If you're in a gray area, there are huge parts of the US where it is just almost impossible to charge. We sent a Rivian from Michigan down to South Carolina, and over the course of the drive, it took 4 times longer than it would have taken in a gas powered car because of the need to find chargers, stop at slower chargers, chargers that didn't work. Even when you have a map, even when you have a plan, it may not work well. We need to have the infrastructure in place, and EVs that don't charge at home aren't practical everywhere. And there are places where, unless you're just using it locally, an EV is not practical at all in the United States. Europe's a bit better, but not much better.
So, as Ambrose has mentioned throughout this webinar, uncertain EV adoption rates have hit OEMs pretty hard, and really anyone throughout the supply base as capacity issues and uncertainty kind of ripple through utilization rates at factories. And we all know that there's things that are lagging in the US, whether it's charging density, pricing parity, things like that. But it's been really hard to kind of put a number to these drivers and how much they impact EV adoption rates and really what we need to do to see the EV adoption rate targets that we've set out. So, how we set about analyzing this, we collected data on the vast majority of US counties, the EV adoption rate disparities between them, and then any drivers that we thought could be impacting these disparities. And then throughout our analysis, we were able to whittle it down to about 5 drivers that have significant impacts on EV adoption rates and how much these drivers are impacting EV adoption. So we were able to bucket these into cost, convenience, and politics. And on the cost side, we kind of look at this through the lens of household income and tax credits. And for convenience, we're looking at charging density in the area as well as local driving habits. And finally, politics is a simple measure of the partisan lean in any given county. And with these drivers, the relationship between them and the outcome variable that we're looking at in EV adoption, they're not linear. So we can't really say that one step change in a driver will have a consistent impact on EV adoption at any given point. But there's a way to interpret this through an example that I've kind of laid out here, and hopefully people will be able to get an understanding of the relative magnitudes. So if we took a county that had 10% EV adoption rate, and the way that we define EV adoption rate is just the percent of new vehicle sales that are EVs. And if we increase the household income of that county by $1,000, keeping everything else constant, we would expect to see a pretty small, just 0.1% increase in EV adoption. Now, on the other hand, if we were to increase the availability of tax credits by $1,000, we would see a 1.1% increase in EV adoption. So what that tells us is EVs are still somewhat of a luxury item because household income is predictive, but really pricing parity is much more of the issue. And once OEMs are able to reach pricing parity, then the average consumer will be able to make these purchases. And that's pretty relevant going forward as we see the federal $7,500 EV tax credit under fire in an incoming Trump administration. And if it were to go away, who would be left that was able to reach pricing parity without incentives? And really, the standout is Tesla. We think that without incentives, they're the only one that's able to sell profitably, and they would benefit a lot from a level playing field with ICE powered vehicles. Then, on the convenience aspect, with charging density, if we were to increase and remain everything else constant, increase in any given county one public fast charger per square mile, we would expect to see EV adoption raised by 0.6%. And on driving habits, if we were to keep everything else constant and increase the driving habits of the average citizen in a county by 1 mile, we would expect to see a drop off of 0.3% in EV adoption rates. So, what that tells us on the convenience side is that density of public fast charging is definitely necessary to see widespread EV adoption. And with funding from the IRA kind of hanging in the balance as the Trump administration comes into office, this could have a pretty large impact on long-term EV adoption. So as of right now, 4.4 billion of the IRA funding has been allocated. It hasn't all actually gone and turned into a charging station yet, but it has been allocated and can be considered safe going forward. And just using some rough math on the average cost of a charger and the amount of ports per charging station, that would be enough for roughly 124,000 fast chargers, which would over triple the amount that we have right now. And then on the funding that is likely to be clawed back, if possible, that's about 3.1 billion or enough for 87,000 fast chargers. So kind of the outcome of the IRA funding, which we'll see how that goes as the Trump administration comes into office, will have a pretty massive impact on how likely EV adoption is in the US. And then on the driving habits portion, that kind of indicates to us that EV reliability is a concern for buyers. People that don't have range anxiety, they're only making small commutes back and forth to work and live in a pretty dense area, they're more likely to buy an EV than someone that has a pretty long commute and conducts pretty regular long distance travel. And then the final point on politics, this is a pretty significant impact. If you were to take any given county and shift it 1 point towards Democrats in terms of the latest general election, we would expect to see an increase in 0.4% of EV sales share. So what that tells us is that despite everything else, and we think that charging and cost and all these things are important, the purchase of an EV is still a pretty political decision. So as we had mentioned, kind of local politics impact someone's likelihood to purchase an EV, but also there's national politics that can kind of force or halt EV adoption. So under the Biden administration, there's kind of been fingers on the scale on through EV demand subsidies, supply subsidies, and then there's also the California standards and CAFE regulations that are coming into play. And what we think will happen is when the Trump administration comes into office, they'll try to pull a lot of these things back and they'll have varying levels of success. So on the demand and supply subsidy side, we think this will come down to legislative action if Congress is willing to repeal or reduce some of the funding that hasn't been allocated yet. We mentioned that a bit earlier with the IRA funding, where there's still a few billion left that hasn't been allocated to specific projects. And then when it comes to California emission standards and fuel economy regulations, that's something that will likely go out to a court battle and be pretty drawn out. So that's something to watch for going forward.
And just taking a quick look as we wrap up here at California set the lead, and to take a look at the state level, a bunch of states have chosen to follow California's plan, which is pretty aggressive. And even California is not really on track to hit those targets for zero emission vehicle sales. So they're currently slightly ahead of the target for 2024, but there's a big step up in 2026, anticipating 35% of vehicles need to be zero emission vehicles. And it doesn't really look like they are on track to do that. Some of the court battles and that Harrison just mentioned could make that even less likely, and some of the federal funding pulling infrastructure funding could make this less likely.
Well, and as we look at the fires in California, a lot of that's being pushed back and looked at for the power companies. So the power companies are always a focus when there's a fire burning in California, as there is today. The grid in California, the grid in the United States is not prepared to have 100% EVs. We will reach a critical point, and we're not far from it right now. The US power grid needs to be made much more robust in order to support the mass deployment of EV infrastructures.
Good point, Ambrose. And I think that will wrap it up for us. If you're following along and you've got a question, please put it in the comments. Ambrose, you can close this out.
I want to thank everyone for joining the webinar. We've talked about tariffs, and tariffs with the Trump administration are going to be a major factor. So we're following it very closely, and we'll continue to talk about it. Talent is going to be a massive discussion moving forward. We've stopped talking about it because of volumes, but that's coming back as we see more shifting of production around the world, as we see more manufacturing network optimizations. Talent is going to become a real issue and a hot topic. And then obviously technology. Technology continues and will always be a fun topic for discussion. We've got the EV, the ICE, and the hybrid technology challenges that we're dealing with, trying to figure out how those all get allocated. We're going to take some questions now, but before we do, I'm going to ask everyone here, if you liked what you heard, go to LinkedIn, follow Seraph, follow me, reach out if you want to discuss more of these topics. As all of you likely know, I like to talk about these topics. Anyone on the team is very happy to talk about it. Reach out to me, reach out to John, reach out to Jay. Let's have a discussion. Let's move forward. So without further ado, let's open the mics for your questions.
Hey, everyone. So I think we can maybe start with one of the first questions that we got from David Clements in the chat, which was talking a little bit about it was one of the better years in terms of overall volume, but that was also one of the top concerns. I don't know, Ambrose, maybe do you have anything you'd like to weigh in on that one?
Well, I like Jay's comment. I think it's all about expectations management. Really, we had a decent year looking back to 2019, but the challenge really is that people were expecting a full recovery. They were expecting higher volumes. EV was going to be better. Things were going to run very differently than they ended up running. So it ended up being a mix issue. It ended up being where we were seeing the volumes, and it ended up being a challenge for people because it was so inconsistent. The releases from OEMs to suppliers and supplier releases to their tiers remain inconsistent, and they remain volatile. And while that happens, the industry just can't perform in an economically viable way. So we need to see more stability. We need to see more predictability. That's how we're set up. And until we get to that point, it's going to be challenging. So while volumes were not horrific, the volatility within that number was very challenging.
Yeah. And Harrison, maybe I know we got some questions about Central America, and I know maybe you could just share a bit about what we did when we were asking people about where they were considering moving to.
Yeah, so we included Latin America as a response option in our survey. Obviously, that's not the same as Central America, but I think we can generally extrapolate and say that the responses to that question are probably indicative of how people feel about Central America. But going forward, we can definitely split up our survey question and get into more detail there.
And Harrison, I've had some discussions about people looking at moving to Costa Rica, which is one of the countries specifically asked about. Costa Rica is a great place to move. The logistics chains are a little bit more complex, so there's more planning required. So it really depends on the type of part that you're going to send down there. There's a great medical device cluster there. Cindy does a fantastic job. Cindy is the Costa Rican Foreign Direct Investment Agency, building things there. There's a group out of NAI that does a lot working in the Americas, and they've helped us look at different things in different countries. But the key thing that we're seeing is logistics chains make it very important to understand which products you're going to move, where you're going to be sourcing components from, and then how you get the components out from whatever country you choose back to the home market in a cost-effective way.
Great. I think we had we had one from David about, do you see the same Main in China push for trucks as you do for passenger vehicles? And I know I can take this a little bit. I usually am looking at a couple different sources of data, whether it's the producers themselves, the trade groups, like in the US, we have trade groups like MEMA for suppliers, and AIAM, but in China they have a couple as well, and most of the reports are in Chinese, which I've actually been surprised at how I can't speak it, but Google Translate actually works pretty well. But also, we have subscriptions to Mark Lines, and that makes things a little simpler. But the data I was looking at showed them gaining share in the commercial vehicle segment as well, and also increasing exports 30% around there. And I think that was the full 2023 data. I don't think they've released their full 2024 data there. So they're somewhere about 700 something thousand exports in the commercial vehicle segment. So to answer simply, yes, I think they are executing that strategy in all sort of motive industries, whether it's construction
including
equipment and
yeah,
yeah.
including aerospace, Justin. I mean,
Mhm.
they're building airframes now to rival Boeing and Airbus. They've got the construction equipment to rival everyone else, farm equipment. They're really trying to capitalize on the expertise that they've gained and the technology that's been transferred to enable them to really grow the market. And they've got a real need to overcome some property and other debt challenges within China. So the more they can export, the better off they are. It's absolutely essential that China can accelerates their export engine because the domestic consumption is low right now.
And Jay, I know you're not on video, but we got a question about the merger talks between Honda and Nissan, and I know you've had some experience with mergers yourself, so maybe you could weigh in if you've got good connection.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me okay. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I've had a lot of people, colleagues ask about that, what I thought about this whole discussion with the Nissan and Honda merger. I lived through the Daimler Chrysler merger and saw what happened there and how that eventually fell apart. And if you look in a lot of the we'll say reports about that and post merger, evaluations, but also just the history of mergers and acquisitions, a lot of it is going to depend on if the Honda and Nissan teams can really understand where their strengths and weaknesses are and how their synergies can add together. What happened with the Daimler Chrysler, what made Chrysler very attractive for Daimler is about their ability to quickly release new models and modular kind of development activities. And there's been a lot written on this. You can look at Harvard Business Review and things of that nature. And when that merger took place, they didn't maximize that. They just kind of forgot about it. And the engineering groups never really worked together. There's only a couple of examples of success, and that's the Jeep Grand Cherokee, the Chrysler 300, Challenger vehicles, where they used previous chassis and drivetrain development from Daimler to just basically crank those vehicles out, and they were quite good. But they didn't really collaborate in any other places, so it eventually fell apart. There wasn't a good model on how they were going to work together going forward. If Honda and Nissan can iron that out and understand where that's at, and then really maximize that, then I could see it being a success. They could turn into a real powerhouse. But the question is, will they be able to do that? They're competing in exactly the same markets. You've got the Sentra and the Civic competing directly against each other, Accord and Altima competing directly against each other. You've got the Ridgeline and the Frontier, which are really, one would argue, two completely different truck designs, but competing in the same, truck market. I know there's been some comments from Honda about Nissan's ability to help them develop large powertrains, so large V8 engine, which Honda doesn't really do right now. Yeah, that could be an area where Honda could gain some of what Nissan knows and does pretty well. They got really nice V8 engines, but Nissan has largely pulled back from that market. They ended the Titan production last year. So the question is do they understand where those strengths and weaknesses are, where they can really work together to maximize it? It could turn out to be very good, but it could be a real disaster and be detrimental to both brands. So we'll see how
Jay,
it goes.
Jay, do you think it's a real merger, or is this more Honda absorbing some Nissan technology? Nissan seemed to be struggling far more than Honda was, and Nissan needed
Yeah.
somewhere to land.
Well, what I've heard, I mean, they call it a merger. It's always a question whether that's the case. Uh, what I've heard and what I've seen, or with my own experience. So my personal opinion, is that Honda, from a vehicle engineering, maybe quality, if you compare a Civic and a Sentra, it's probably a little bit more higher end, a little nicer vehicles. Not, I wouldn't say that's across the board on everything. In the smaller cars, I think Honda's a little better. In the mid-sized cars, they're very comparable. And so it really is a question of, are they going to work together to develop common powertrains, and then share that? Are they going to work with their supply bases to, you know, share those kinds of technologies? I know hybrid's a big question. That's an area that Nissan struggles, which is very interesting since they've been making the all electric Leaf for so many years. And hybrid is where Honda's kind of strong compared to
Hmm.
Nissan. So if they can roll that hybrid technology into Nissans, that'll be very beneficial for them. I mean, Nissan has a huge manufacturing footprint. So from that respects, they're probably, could be helpful with Honda. But I don't know that they call it a merger. It's hard to have two bosses running the show. So we'll see how it plays out. I mean, the big thing for Nissan, one of the big complaints with Nissan, and there's been a lot of things posted online about it, is their vehicle development cycle is way too long. They keep vehicles in the market way too long. They don't freshen them up quick enough. I know they're fighting like crazy. They've got a lot of plans for a lot of vehicle refreshes over the next few years, like the numbers 25 or 30 vehicle refreshes worldwide. Um, it's again, it just all comes down to uh, understanding those strengths and weaknesses and where they can work together and doing it effectively. Otherwise, it's just you get in each other's way, and it's nothing more than news headlines.
I think there were maybe one question from Henning was about any insight on how legacy OEMs will change their future development cycle. Ambrose, I'm not sure if you have any views on that.
It's not really clear yet. I think we're likely going to see programs pushed out in Europe, especially. The European economy right now, as I've talked about earlier, continues to struggle. It's a real challenge, and there was just a World Economic Forum report that came out, and I'm going to go into geopolitics for a minute. It really, and then this will come back to what the development cycle will look like. There's a lot higher risk perceived by global leaders around armed conflict than anything else. That's a bigger concern for them than tariffs or other things. And we'll share an image of the chart in this chat after the meeting. But what I'm seeing is I'm seeing external forces pushing the OEMs as volumes fall off. I had some meetings in Germany, and the volume decreases that we're hearing about from OEMs really mean that they've got to optimize their development cycle, slow down the number of products that they're refreshing, refine what they're doing, and focus on a few platforms in order to drive profitability. Without that focus, without that accurate attention to detail, it's going to be hard. You just can't fund everything at this point in time, and it's making things very challenging for a lot of OEMs. The volumes, as Justin's throwing up a slide now, volumes are really going to challenge everything, and this has been 2024. The end of 2024 is a year of volumes. Volumes, mix changes, release volatility drove a lot of conflict. So when we look at development programs, I think we're going to see fewer refreshes. We're going to see focused decisions made on what platforms are invested in. And then I believe we'll see the OEMs put the right people, the best people, onto the programs that they choose to pursue and follow their phase gate process much more religiously. We won't see things slip through. We'll see higher suppliers be held more accountable. And I think a lot of us know and understand working with Toyota or Honda on a vehicle development program is challenging because they want things to be done well, and they don't do the extent of design changes throughout the program post-design freeze that others do. We'll see those design changes slow a bit, and we'll see more pressure on the engineering teams to get it right early, and possibly less drive from sales to add infinite permutations of a product to the offering so that there can be more focus and a more refined, developed, and profitable product coming out. So
Yeah, and I brought this slide up too. Just it's in the full report. We didn't share the full report, so we'll be sharing the PDF with everybody who signed up or attended or who's subscribed to our report. But one of the things we noticed, at least in our analysis of the U.S. industry, is that within the last couple years, especially with the rise of EV, and as Ambrose had kind of highlighted, technology was one of our key themes. Because of this, is we got ambitious, and so the total number of nameplates and different models OEMs had scheduled to release were it actually shrinked the amount that was being produced per nameplate. And what we have seen from that is a lot of variability in between that. So I think Ambrose's comment on being more focused makes sense, because we've seen over the last maybe 18 months more delays, which kind of hint at that focus as they figure out what makes sense to work on. And let's see, I think we're pretty much wrapping up. And well, thank you very much. Unless Ambrose, I just heard you say
I just want to say
so.
thank you to everyone for joining. We appreciate the opportunity to talk. Please reach out to myself, Justin, Harrison, Jay, John Stoner, if you've got any questions or you want to have further discussions. Our contact details are in the report, and we'll send it out to everyone that registered. If you're interested in this report and you did not register, please comment in LinkedIn or send us an email. We look forward to speaking to you all soon again. We'll probably have another webinar shortly after Trump is inaugurated to just talk about the tariffs and the changes that are going to come through for trade policy as things become a little more clear. We know there are a lot of executive orders being written right now, some of which are in conflict or seem to be. So as we learn more, as we see what actually gets signed and put in place, we'll be able to talk more coherently about what the plans are. So I look forward to speaking to you all soon. Thanks for joining.